My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 33 years old. And 10 months ago, I sat alone in a parking lot in the rain, outside a funeral home I was not allowed to enter, and I said goodbye to my grandmother through a windshield. I want you to understand something before I say another word. My grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, was not just the person who loved me. She was the only person in my family who ever saw me clearly, who looked at me without the lens of what I was supposed to be, without the weight of my father's disappointment or my brother's entitlement, and saw who I actually was. She was 81 years old. She had lived in the same house for 47 years. She made lemon cake on Sundays and kept a garden that she tended with the patience of someone who had learned that the things worth having take their time. She was the safest place I had ever known. And when she died, my father called me and said 7 words that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "Don't come to the funeral, Nora. Don't." I did not go to the funeral. I drove to the parking lot. I sat there in the rain for 2 hours, while people I had grown up beside filed inside to say goodbye to the one person who had loved me unconditionally. And then I drove home and I sat on my kitchen floor, and I felt something I did not yet have a name for. 8 days later, I received a call from an attorney I had never heard of. He said my grandmother had left a will. He said my presence was legally required at the reading. He said my name was in it. I want to tell you what was in that will. I want to tell you what happened in that room when the attorney read it out loud, and what my father's face looked like, and what my grandmother had written in her own words to explain exactly why. But before I tell you that, I need to take you back. Not to the funeral, not to the parking lot. Back to the family I grew up in, and the woman who watched all of it from a chair by the window and said nothing, until she said everything. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My father's name is Richard Calloway. He is 60 years old. He is a successful commercial developer who has spent his entire adult life building something that looks, from the outside, like a dynasty. He is the kind of man who uses the word legacy without irony. He has broad shoulders and a firm handshake and the specific confidence of someone who decided early that the world would arrange itself around him and found, to his consistent satisfaction, that he was mostly right. He is not cruel in obvious ways. He does not shout. He does not break things. He is precise and controlled, and he dispenses his approval and disapproval with the care of someone who understands that those two currencies, distributed correctly, can shape people more effectively than anything louder. I am his daughter by biology and his disappointment by design. My brother Marcus is 37. He is 4 years older than me, taller than my father by an inch, and has worn the expression of a man who has always known his inheritance was secure since approximately the age of 12. He is not unkind either, not in obvious ways. He simply occupies space with the ease of someone who has never had to justify his right to be in it. My father began positioning Marcus as the family's future when Marcus was 16 and I was 12. I know this precisely because I remember the summer it happened. The summer my father took Marcus to his first development site and came home talking about the next generation of Calloway properties. And I understood, in the specific way that 12-year-olds understand things they cannot yet articulate, that the next generation did not include me. The next 6 years were a kind of slow confirmation of that understanding. My father paid for Marcus's business degree without question. When he needed $20,000 to cover a gap between his graduation and his first salary, my father transferred the money the same afternoon it was asked for. When I was 18 and received a scholarship to a university 3 states away for an environmental science program, my father sat across from me at the dinner table and said, "That's a long way." I said, "I know. It's a good program." He said, "There are good programs closer." I said, "I want to go." He said, "You'll come back after." I said, "I'll come back after." He nodded, not with pride, with the specific nod of a man allowing something he has decided not to fight. I left. I studied. I did not come back after in the way he intended. I graduated and found a position with an environmental consulting firm in the city where I had gone to school, and I built something of my own, slowly and carefully, that had nothing to do with Calloway properties or the family's idea of what I was supposed to become. My father, over the years that followed, interpreted my independence as rejection. Every professional decision I made that did not loop back to the family business was framed, in the family's private language, as Nora going her own way. The phrase was not affectionate. It was the specific designation for the child who had refused to perform the required loyalty. I called home. I visited twice a year. I showed up for holidays and family events and birthday dinners where my father asked Marcus about his current projects and asked me, with the polite interest he reserved for things he had decided did not matter, how work was going. I stayed, not because it was comfortable, because my grandmother was there. Eleanor Calloway lived 15 minutes from my parents' house, in the home where she had raised my father and his brother, in a neighborhood that had changed around her in the 47 years she had refused to leave it. She had a garden with tomatoes and dahlias and a back porch where she kept 2 chairs that she had never replaced because she said when you find a chair that is right, you keep it. I would visit her every time I came home, not as a courtesy. Because her house was the one place in my family's orbit where I felt like a whole person rather than a subordinate clause. She would make tea. She would ask real questions. Not how is work going in the perfunctory tone my father used, but real questions that required real answers. What was I learning? What did I care about? What was hard? What was good? She listened to the answers the way some people have forgotten how to listen, as if the answer was the point rather than the question. I told her things I told no one else in my family. About the loneliness of building a life from scratch in a city where I knew no one. About the specific grief of calling home and feeling like a guest in my own family. About the times I had wondered whether my father's version of me, the disappointing one, the one who had gone her own way, was the true version, and the one I told myself was simply optimism I hadn't earned. She would listen. And then she would say something that reached past the surface of what I had said to the thing underneath it. She said once, when I was 27 and sitting on her back porch in the second of her 2 right chairs, after I had told her about a particularly painful phone call with my father, "Nora, your father has mistaken obedience for loyalty his whole life. He's wrong about that. He just hasn't found out yet." I said, "What does finding out look like?" She looked at her garden for a moment. "The tomatoes, the dahlias," she said, "something that makes it undeniable." I did not know what she meant by that then. I would understand later. The thing that broke my relationship with my father, the specific thing that moved the tension from manageable to permanent, happened when I was 31. There had been a piece of land. A parcel of undeveloped property on the edge of a wetland corridor that my father had been watching for years as a potential development site. It was in a protected zone, but he had a theory about the regulatory pathway that would allow residential construction on its edges, and he had been cultivating relationships with the relevant planning officials for some time. He called me because he wanted my firm's assessment. I was, by this point, a senior consultant at an environmental consulting firm. We did regulatory impact assessments. We knew exactly what was and was not buildable under federal and state wetland protections. He wanted a favorable assessment. He did not say that directly. What he said was, "I need an environmental review. Your firm does environmental reviews. I thought you could help." I said, "I'd need to run it through the firm as a formal engagement. I can't just give you an informal opinion on something this significant." He said, "I'm not asking for informal. I'm asking for your professional work." We ran the assessment. 6 weeks. I led it personally because it was my father's project and I wanted to be sure the work was done correctly. The assessment found that approximately 80% of the parcel was undevelopable under current protections. The edge parcels had some potential but were significantly constrained. The returns on a residential development would not justify the regulatory risk. I sent him the report. He called me that evening. He said, "This isn't what I needed." I said, "It's what the land is, Dad." He said, "There's flexibility in these assessments. There's always flexibility." I said, "Not in this one. The wetland boundary is clearly documented. The federal buffer requirements are explicit. There is no pathway to what you're planning." He said, "I need you to revise it." I said, "I can't revise the findings because you don't like them." He said, "Nora, I said, Dad, if I revised a regulatory assessment to support development that the science doesn't support, I would lose my professional credentials. That is not a small thing. He said, you're choosing your career over your family. I said, I'm doing my job. He said, your job is what you have instead of a family. The line went quiet after that. I did not respond. There was nothing to say to it that would not make things worse. He said, I'll have another firm do it. I said, okay. He did. The other firm found a way to structure the assessment more favorably. The development was stalled anyway 18 months later by a federal agency challenge that proved the original science correct. My father did not call me about that either. But from that phone call forward, the distance between us was no longer about the accumulation of smaller disappointments. It was a fixed point, a specific moment that both of us carried. He began cutting me out in ways that were no longer ambiguous. The holiday dinner where he had Marcus's wife give the toast and did not ask me to speak. The family business announcement sent to the entire extended family email list that I was removed from without notice. The birthday of his that I showed up for with a gift and found myself seated at the far end of the table while my father spoke exclusively to Marcus and his wife throughout the meal. These were not accidents. They were the careful erosion of someone who has decided you are no longer part of the picture and is simply implementing that decision gradually. I kept visiting my grandmother through all of it. I kept sitting in the second chair on her back porch. I kept telling her the things I could not say to anyone else in the family. She listened. She asked her real questions. She looked at her garden. She never told me what she was doing. Not once. I did not know she was doing anything. My grandmother had a stroke in January. She was at home in her kitchen at 7 in the morning. She had been making her tea, which she had made every morning for 40 years at the same time in the same kitchen, and she sat down in her chair and did not get up again. The neighbor who had a key found her an hour later. My father called me from the hospital. I flew home that afternoon. She was alive. She was in a room with good light and a nurse who came regularly and a prognosis that the doctors characterized as uncertain in the specific way of people who know more than they are saying and are choosing their words carefully. I sat with her for 4 days. She was not always awake. When she was, she held my hand and looked at me. She did not say much. She said my name twice. The second time, she said it with a clarity that made me lean closer. She said, Nora, the attorney's name is Philip Marsh. I said, Grandma. She said, remember that. Philip Marsh. She closed her eyes. I said the name to myself 3 times in the hallway outside her room. I wrote it in my phone. I did not know what it meant, but I understood, from the specific clarity with which she had said it, that it was important. She improved. Not to what she had been, but to something stable and, at moments, bright. I flew home after 10 days because I had work obligations I could not defer further. I called her 3 times a week. She was slower on the phone than she had been, but she was there, asking her real questions, looking at her garden through the window. In June, 5 months after the stroke, she died in her sleep. My aunt called me, not my father. My aunt, my grandmother's daughter-in-law, who had always been kind in the ways that people who live adjacent to difficult dynamics can be kind. I said, when? She said, overnight she just went. I said, was she? She said she was in her own bed, in her own room. She was peaceful, Nora. I sat with that for a moment, then I called my father. He answered on the second ring. His voice was the controlled one, not grief exactly. The voice of a man managing a situation. He said, you've heard. I said, yes, Dad, I want to come. I want to be there for the service. A pause, he said, the service is private, family. I said, Dad, I'm family. He said, Nora, a longer pause, the specific pause of someone who has already made a decision and is now executing it. You stopped being part of this family a long time ago. Don't come to the funeral, don't. He hung up. I held the phone in both hands. I want to tell you what the room felt like in that moment. My apartment. My kitchen. The morning light coming through the window I had chosen in the place I had built from my own work. All of it real, all of it mine. And the voice of my father, 7 words, reaching across all of it and landing like something thrown. You stopped being part of this family a long time ago. I sat on my kitchen floor. I put the phone on the tile beside me. I pressed both palms flat on the floor the way you do when the world is tilting and you need to feel something solid. I thought about going anyway. I thought about it seriously, in the way you think about things when someone has taken your choices away and you are considering taking them back. But here is what I thought about harder: my grandmother. About the kind of woman she was. About the fact that a scene at her funeral, with my father and Marcus and the extended family and the people she had known for 47 years all watching, was not the way I wanted to say goodbye to her. She deserved better than to have her service turned into the culmination of the war my father had been waging against my existence in this family. She deserved the peace she had always tried to create. I did not go. I drove to the parking lot of the funeral home and I sat in the rain for 2 hours and I said goodbye through the windshield. I said everything I would have said at the service if I had been allowed to be there. The things she had given me, the second chair, the real questions. The name Philip Marsh, which I had written in my phone and did not yet understand. Then I drove home. I did not cry until I got inside. Then I cried for a very long time. 8 days after the funeral, my phone rang. Unknown number. Local area code for my grandmother's city. I answered. The voice was professional and unhurried. He said, "Am I speaking with Nora Calloway?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Philip Marsh. I'm an estate attorney. I'm calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Calloway. I believe you may have heard my name." I was standing at my kitchen counter with a glass of water. I set the glass down. I said, "She mentioned you." He said, "I've been Mrs. Calloway's attorney for 11 years. She prepared a will and asked me to contact you personally when the time came. She was specific about that I was to call you directly and separately from the other family members." I said, "She prepared a will?" He said, "Yes, and your presence is legally required at the formal reading. I want to prepare you. There will be other family members present, including your father and your brother. But Mrs. Calloway was explicit that you be there. She put it in writing as a condition of the will's execution." I said, "She put it in writing?" He said, "She was a very precise woman, Ms. Calloway." I pressed my hand flat on the counter. I said, "When?" He said, "Saturday, 10 in the morning, I'll send you the address." I said, "Mr. Marsh?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Can you tell me, is this going to be difficult?" There was a pause, not uncomfortable, considered. He said, "Mrs. Calloway asked me to tell you something if you ask that question. She said she expected you might." A pause. "She said to tell you, you've already done the hard part. Saturday is just the truth arriving." I pressed my hand flat on the counter. I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll be there." The 5 days between Philip Marsh's call and the Saturday reading were the longest 5 days of my life. Not because I was planning anything. Not because I was building a case or rehearsing what I would say. Simply because I was living inside the specific suspension of someone who has been told that the world is about to shift and cannot yet see the shape of the shift. I thought about my grandmother constantly. About every conversation we had ever had on that back porch. About the way she used to look at the garden when she was thinking about something she was not yet ready to say. About how many of those silences, I now understood, had been full of things she was holding. She had been watching for years. She had been listening to me the way she listened to everything, not just to what was said, but to what was happening underneath it. And she had decided, in the precise and unhurried way she did everything, to do something about it. She had not told me. She had not warned me. She had simply said, "Philip Marsh. Remember that." And then she had gone to her own bed and made the decision that was not a decision, and gone. I drove to my grandmother's city on Friday evening and checked into a hotel. I did not call my father to announce I was coming. I had been told by an attorney that my presence was legally required. That was sufficient. I pressed my clothes. I went to bed at 10. I slept 4 hours. I got up at 6 and sat at the small hotel desk and drank the coffee the machine made and looked out the window at a city that was quiet in the specific way of early Saturday mornings. I thought about what my grandmother had said. "Your father has mistaken obedience for loyalty his whole life." He's wrong about that. He just hasn't found out yet. What does finding out look like? Something that makes it undeniable. I understood now. I still did not know the specifics, but I understood the shape of it. At 9:45, I drove to the address Philip Marsh had sent. A professional building, not a courthouse. Clean and neutral. Designed for exactly the kind of quiet, consequential moments that do not happen in courtrooms but feel like they should. I sat in my car for 5 minutes. I went in. The conference room had a long table with 6 chairs. Philip Marsh sat at one end. He was in his 50s, dark gray suit, the face of a man who had spent his career in rooms where important things were said and had learned to let the things do the work without adding to them. My father and Marcus were already seated when I came in. They were on one side of the table. My aunt, my father's sister-in-law, my grandmother's son's wife, sat beside them. When I walked in, my father looked up. His expression moved through 3 things very quickly: surprise, calculation. Then the controlled flatness he used in professional settings where he needed to appear composed. Marcus looked at me the way you look at someone you did not expect to see in a room and are not sure how to respond to. My aunt said, "Nora." I said, "Aunt Carol." She stood and hugged me. It was brief and warm, and she held on slightly longer than you would for a greeting, the specific length of someone communicating something that the room does not yet allow them to say out loud. I sat down across from my father. There was one empty chair between us. I sat in the one directly across. He said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Mr. Marsh contacted me. My presence is legally required." He looked at Philip Marsh. Philip Marsh looked back with the neutral professionalism of someone who is not going to be moved by that look. My father said, "She wasn't at the funeral." Philip Marsh said, "The will's conditions are independent of the funeral arrangements, Mr. Calloway. Shall we begin?" My father's jaw tightened fractionally. He sat back. I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at the folder in front of Philip Marsh. I breathed. Marcus said nothing. He was looking at the folder too. Something in his expression was the specific expression of a person who has assumed for so long that a certain outcome is guaranteed that they cannot yet imagine the alternative. The expression of confidence that has not yet been tested. Philip Marsh opened the folder. He said, "I'll begin with the formal preamble before reading the specific bequests. Mrs. Calloway was careful about the structure of this document and asked that it be read in full, in order, without interruption. He looked at the room once, the look of a man establishing terms, then he looked down at the document. He said, "I, Eleanor Grace Calloway, being of sound mind and deliberate intention, set forth this will as the complete and final expression of my wishes regarding the disposition of my estate. I have prepared this document over the course of the past 14 months with the counsel of Philip Marsh, and I have done so with full knowledge of my family's circumstances, and with the specific intention of ensuring that the truth of those circumstances is part of the record." He paused. He said, "The truth of those circumstances." He read those words again, not for effect, because they were in the document and deserved a moment. My father shifted in his chair. Philip Marsh continued, "I am going to tell you what was in the will, not every legal provision, but the shape of it. And I am going to tell you what my grandmother wrote, in her own words, because those words are the center of everything and they deserve to be heard. The estate included several assets. My grandmother's house, the one she had lived in for 47 years, with its garden and its 2 right chairs and its kitchen where she had made her tea every morning. A modest investment portfolio she had accumulated through careful saving over decades. A collection of items with personal and sentimental value, and a small rental property she had acquired 20 years earlier that had been quietly generating income ever since. Philip Marsh read through the preliminary bequests first. A set of items to my Aunt Carol, chosen with the specificity of someone who knew each recipient well. A sum to a local children's library where my grandmother had volunteered for 12 years. Personal items to several longtime friends. My father sat through these with the patience of someone waiting for the part that concerned him. He had his hands on the table. His posture was the composed posture. Marcus was less composed. He was very still in the way of someone who has tightened their whole body against the possibility of being surprised. Then Philip Marsh reached the section that contained the primary bequests. He said, "The family home at 14 Alderman Street, including all contents and the real property, I leave in its entirety to my granddaughter Nora Calloway." The room changed, not loudly, but completely. My father's hand moved just slightly, a fraction of an inch, then controlled. Marcus's stillness broke in one specific way. His eyes went from Philip Marsh to me and stayed there. Philip Marsh did not look up. He kept reading. He said, "The rental property at 22 Birch Lane, including all associated income rights, I leave in its entirety to my granddaughter Nora Calloway." My father said, "What?" It was not a question, it was a sound. Philip Marsh said, without inflection, "I've been asked to read without interruption, Mr. Calloway. There is an explanatory statement following the bequests." My father said, "There has to be a mistake." Philip Marsh said, "There is no mistake. May I continue?" My father was quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has not yet decided how to manage something. Philip Marsh said, "The investment portfolio, valued at the date of this will's preparation at approximately $340,000, I leave in equal portions to Nora Calloway and to my daughter-in-law Carol Renner Calloway." My aunt made a sound, small. She pressed her hand to her mouth. My brother said, "Nothing." Not loudly, just the word, "nothing." It arrived in the room and sat there. Philip Marsh read 2 more minor provisions, then he reached the final section. He said, "I have asked Philip to include a written statement as part of this document, which I have composed myself. It is my wish that this statement be read aloud in the presence of the beneficiaries and other family members present. It is as follows." He paused, he looked up at the room once. His expression was careful and steady, the expression of someone who is about to say something that a woman wrote and trusted him to deliver, and is going to do that correctly regardless of who is in the room. Then he looked down, and he read my grandmother's words. He said, "I am writing this statement because I believe that what I leave behind should carry an explanation, and because I am old enough and honest enough to know that the truth should not wait for the right moment. There is no right moment. There is only the moment you have. I have loved my family for all of my life. I love my son Richard. I love my grandson Marcus. I love my daughter-in-law Carol. Their presence in my life has been a gift in the ways that complex things can be gifts, imperfectly, sometimes painfully, but genuinely. I love my granddaughter Nora. I love her the way I loved her from the first time I held her completely and without conditions. I have watched her become a remarkable person. I have also watched what her family, and specifically her father, has done with that person. I am old. I have had a long time to observe, and a long time to decide what I thought about what I observed. What I observed was this. Nora was never given what Marcus was given, not the patience, not the investment, not the simple, steady assumption that her existence in this family was an asset rather than a complication. She was asked to be grateful for crumbs offered as gifts and to call the remainder her independence. She chose independence anyway, not because she didn't want the family. Because the family, as structured by her father, required that she disappear in order to belong. And Nora, to her enduring credit, refused to disappear. I watched my son erase her gradually and call it family values. I watched him give Marcus everything and give Nora the message that her refusals were her own fault. I watched him exclude her from dinners and announcements and decisions, and eventually, I suspect, from things I did not live to witness. I am not angry at my son. He made choices that reflect who he is, and who he is more complicated than this moment will allow me to explain. But I am clear about one thing. I have assets to leave. Those assets are mine. I worked for them and saved them and held them carefully for decades. And I will leave them to the person I trust most to carry them into the future correctly. That person is Nora, not because she is more deserving in some abstract sense, because I have watched her, for 33 years, do the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. I have watched her refuse to compromise what was true for what was comfortable. I have watched her stay honest with me even when honesty cost her something. Those are the qualities I want associated with what I leave behind. To my son Richard, I love you. And I want you to understand something that I believe you are capable of understanding, even if it is hard. The daughter you have been discarding is the one who was most like me. I recognized her from the beginning. And I hope, when the difficulty of this moment passes, that you will take some time to consider what you have been throwing away. It is not too late for that, but it requires you to tell the truth about what you have done. To my granddaughter, Nora, I am sorry that I could not protect you from the years. I hope that what I have left you carries the same message I tried to carry in every conversation we ever had in those 2 chairs on the back porch. You were always enough. You were always more than enough. I have always been proud of you, and I have always been on your side, even when I was too old and too tired to fight it out loud. The chairs come with the house. Do not replace them. With all the love I have. Eleanor Grace Calloway. Philip Marsh closed the folder. The room was quiet in a way I have never experienced a room being quiet before or since. Not the polite quiet of a ceremony or the awkward quiet of an unexpected moment. The quiet of a room where something has arrived that is so precisely, inescapably true that there is nothing available to say in response to it. My grandmother's words were in the air. In the specific way that something written is also spoken when it is read aloud, not just described but present. She was in that room, not metaphorically. The woman who had sat in the second right chair and asked real questions and looked at her garden when she was holding something, she was present in every word Philip Marsh had read. I was not crying. I am noting that because I want to be accurate. I was not crying in the way you might expect. I was very still. I had both hands flat on the table. I was breathing slowly, and I was looking at the folder in front of Philip Marsh because looking anywhere else felt like more than I could manage at that particular moment. My Aunt Carol was crying. She made no effort to conceal it. She pressed her hand to her mouth and let the tears go. Marcus was looking at the table. The expression he had when Philip Marsh began reading, the confidence of a man certain of what was coming, was entirely gone. What remained was something that had no armor over it, something undefended. It was the first time in my life I had seen my brother look genuinely young. My father. I looked at my father last. He was not crying. He was not still. He was the specific opposite of still, the composed exterior maintaining itself through visible effort, holding the container of his face in place while something inside it rearranged. He was looking at me, not with the calculating look from when I walked in. Not with the assessing look I had been receiving from him my whole life. Something else. Something that I looked at for a moment and could not name fully because I had never seen it directed at me before. Then he looked away. He looked at the folder in front of Philip Marsh. He looked at the window. Philip Marsh said, into the quiet, "I'll give the family some time. I'll be in the outer office when you're ready to discuss the legal process for the estate transfer." He gathered his papers. He stood. He left the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this job for a long time and knows exactly when to step out. The door closed. The 4 of us sat in the room that Philip Marsh had just left. My father and Marcus and my Aunt Carol and me, and the air that still had my grandmother's words in it. My aunt was the first to speak. She said, "Nora, she talked about you all the time. I want you to know that. Whenever I visited her, she talked about you." I said, "I know she did." She said, "She loved you so much." I said, "I know." I looked at my father. He had not moved. Marcus said, "Nora." I looked at him. He said, "I didn't know he told you not to come to the funeral." I said, "I figured you might not." He said, "I would have." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I don't know what I would have done. I want to say I would have pushed back. I don't actually know." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth." I said, "It's worth something." My father was still looking at the window. I said, "Dad." He turned, slowly, the way you turn toward something you have been putting off turning toward. I said, "She told you what she needed to tell you. I'm not going to add to it today." He said, "Nora." I said, "I'm not doing this today. I am going to go talk to Mr. Marsh about the estate transfer. If you want to have a real conversation at some point, I will have it. But not today." He said, "She left you the house." I said, "Yes." He said, "She left you everything important." I said, "She left me what she chose to leave me. which was her right. He said, I didn't think. I said, I know you didn't. He said, I thought she agreed with me. About you. About the choices you made. I said, she never agreed with you about me, Dad. She was just patient about how she disagreed. He said, all those years. He stopped. I looked at my father, 60 years old, composed exterior, the man who had called me a disappointment in every language except directly, who had said don't come to the funeral and meant it as a final thing. And I saw, for the first time, something that was not his power or his authority or his preference for Marcus or his cold management of me. I saw a man sitting with the specific weight of having been shown by his own mother that he had gotten something fundamentally wrong. I was not glad about it. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was not triumph. It was not vindication in the clean, satisfying sense. It was the complicated, mixed-up feeling of someone who has been hurt for a long time watching the person who hurt them understand the hurt in a way that does not undo any of it but is still unmistakably real. I said, Dad, she loved you too. She wrote that she loved you. He said nothing. I said, she wrote it because it was true. I stood up, I picked up my bag, I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the door handle. I said, the house still has the garden, I'm going to take care of it. I went to find Philip Marsh. I need to pause here. Because I need to be honest with you about what happened inside me in the hours after I left that room. People sometimes assume that the moment of vindication is the moment everything resolves. That the reading of the will was a climax after which I felt whole and certain and complete. It was not like that. What I felt, driving back to the hotel, was something much more tangled. There was something that was related to relief, but was not exactly relief. Something that was related to grief, but was not the same grief I had carried into the parking lot 8 days earlier. Something that was gratitude and sorrow, and the strange ache of hearing someone say exactly what you needed to hear from someone who is no longer there to hear you say thank you. My grandmother had done something extraordinary. She had planned quietly and over a long time, and without telling me, because telling me would have changed the nature of it. She had waited until the moment when the truth could not be managed or reframed or absorbed into my father's narrative about our family. She had put it in writing in a legal document with her attorney as witness, and she had made it irrevocable. She had done the one thing that could not be undone, and in doing it, she had told me something more important than anything in the will. She had told me that she saw me. That she had always seen me. That every conversation on that back porch, every real question, every look at the garden that preceded something honest, all of it had been done by someone who was paying full attention, who understood what was happening to me, who had decided, in her 81 years of patient observation, that the truth deserved a room. She gave it one. I cried in the hotel room for about an hour. Not sad tears exactly. The kind that come when something you have been holding for a very long time finally gets to be set down. Then I called my friend Jess, who had been my closest friend for 12 years and who knew the shape of my family in the way that close friends know things, not through explanation, but through the accumulation of 1,000 smaller things. I told her everything. The phone call with Philip Marsh. The drive to the hotel, the room, the will, my grandmother's words. Jess was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, Nora, she planned all of that. She sat with it for over a year. I said, I know. She said, she loved you so specifically. I said, yes. She said, are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I said, I think I'm going to be. She said, that's different from yes. I said, I know. But it's true. Here is the part of the story I almost did not include, because it is the most complicated part and the one that reflects least cleanly. 2 days after the will reading, my father's attorney sent a letter. It was addressed to Philip Marsh. Philip called me to inform me of its contents. The letter stated that my father intended to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence. The argument was that my grandmother, in the months following her stroke, had been in a state of cognitive vulnerability, and that her decisions regarding the estate, specifically the decisions that deviated from what the family had reasonably expected, may have reflected the influence of outside parties rather than her genuine wishes. Outside parties, I was the outside party. The argument, Philip explained carefully, was that my visits to my grandmother during her decline, my regular phone calls, my position as the person she spoke to most frequently and most openly, had given me disproportionate influence over a woman whose judgment may have been compromised. He said, "I want to be transparent with you about what this means. A will contest is a legal proceeding. It will take time and cost money on both sides. And it requires us to defend a leaner's state of mind at the time the will was executed." I said, "When was it executed?" He said, 14 months before her death, 8 months before her stroke. I let that sit for a moment. I said, "She wrote the will 8 months before the stroke." He said, "She did, I have the documentation. The execution date is clear." Any argument about cognitive vulnerability during her final months is irrelevant to a will executed before she was ill. I said, "Will he know that?" He said, "His attorney should know it." Whether that stops him depends on whether he wants this to be about the law or about something else. I said, "What's the something else?" He said, "Control, or the appearance of it." I sat with that for a long time. Here is what the near loss felt like, not a legal near loss, an emotional one. Because the moment I heard about the contest, something happened in my chest that I had not expected. Not fear of losing the house or the property, something older and more specific. The fear that the room where my grandmother's words had finally arrived would be taken back. That my father would find a way to put it back in the box. That the truth she had worked so carefully to make irrevocable would somehow be made revocable after all. I sat in my hotel room. I had extended my stay to work with Philip on the estate transfer, and I thought about what fighting a will contest would mean. The time, the cost. The process of having my relationship with my grandmother examined by attorneys and potentially a court as if it were something suspicious rather than something sacred. I thought about giving up. I want to be honest about that. I thought about calling Philip and saying it is not worth it. That the house was just a house, and the property was just a property, and the money was just money, and none of it was worth what defending it would cost. I got very close to that, and then I thought about what my grandmother had written. She wrote, "I have done so with full knowledge of my family's circumstances and with the specific intention of ensuring that the truth of those circumstances is part of the record." The truth is part of the record. She had not just left me a house. She had placed her own words, her own account, her own deliberate testimony into a legal document that was now the official record of what had happened in this family. Contesting the will did not erase that. Even a successful contest would not erase it. The statement was filed. It was real. It existed. She had made the truth irrevocable before she made the assets transferable. That was the order she had chosen. Not by accident. I called Philip the next morning. I said, "We're not settling. Whatever he files, we respond." Philip said, "Understood, and Nora, I want you to know. The execution date alone is going to make this very difficult for his side to sustain." He was right. My father's attorney filed a formal petition 2 weeks later. Philip's response documented the will's execution date. My grandmother's demonstrated mental clarity at the time of execution, the professional relationship with Philip spanning 11 years, and a letter from my grandmother's physician confirming her cognitive status at the time of the will's preparation. The petition was withdrawn 41 days later. Philip called me when it happened. He said, "It's done. The estate transfer can proceed." I said, "Thank you, Philip." He said, "Mrs. Calloway prepared well. I don't think she expected anything different from this." I said, "No. I don't think she did either." 3 weeks after the petition was withdrawn, my father called me, not his attorney. Him. I was in the garden. My grandmother's garden, my garden now, technically, though it did not feel like mine yet, and perhaps never would in the specific way it had been hers. I had been learning the names of what she had planted. The dahlias were the ones she had described to me over the phone in the months before her death, and I had come out to water them that morning and stayed, because the morning was quiet, and the garden was the kind of place that made quiet feel like something you want to keep. My phone rang. His name on the screen. I looked at it for 3 rings. I answered. He said, "Nora." I said, "Dad." He said, "I withdrew the petition." I said, I know. He said, I wanted you to hear it from me. I said, okay. He said nothing for a moment. In the background, I could hear the specific ambient sound of his office, which I had sat in many times and could identify precisely. He said, I have been thinking about what she wrote. I said, so have I. He said, she said I mistook obedience for loyalty. I said, yes. He said, she was right. I did not say anything. He said, I need you to know that I understand that. I'm not sure yet what I do with understanding it, but I understand it. I said, I know she wanted you to. He said, she was always more honest than the rest of us. I said, yes. He said, is the garden okay? I looked at the dahlias, at the tomatoes, at the two right chairs on the back porch, which I had not yet sat in because sitting in them felt like something that required more time than 10 months. I said, the garden is good, Dad. She kept it well. He made a sound, small and brief and then controlled. He said, I'll let you go. I said, Dad. He said, yes. I thought about what I wanted to say. There were many options. I sat with them for a moment. I said, she wrote that it's not too late. For you, that it requires you to tell the truth about what you've done. She believed that was possible. He was quiet. I said, I believe it too, not because everything is fixed, but because she knew you better than anyone and she still believed it. He said, I don't know if I deserve that. I said, she didn't write it because you deserved it. She wrote it because she loved you. He said, yes. He said, thank you, Nora. We said goodbye. He hung up. I stood in the garden for a while after. The dahlias, the morning, the two right chairs. Then I went inside and made tea in my grandmother's kitchen, in her house, which was mine now. And I sat at her kitchen table with the tea and the quiet, and I let the morning be what it was. It has been 10 months since the will was read. I live in the house on Alderman Street, not full-time. I travel for work, and I keep my apartment in the city, but I am here most weekends, and I am here whenever I need to be somewhere that feels like the truest version of home I have ever known. The garden is in better shape than I feared it would be after months without her care. Plants, it turns out, are more resilient than we give them credit for. The tomatoes came back. The dahlias are enormous this year, fuller than the photographs she used to send me. I am not the gardener she was, but I am learning, slowly and carefully, the way she taught me to learn things. I sit in the second chair most Sunday mornings, not because I am performing grief or honoring a ritual, because the second chair is the right chair and I always knew that, and now I have the time and the stillness to be in it. My father and I have spoken 4 more times since the phone call in the garden. The conversations are careful and short and honest in a way that our conversations were not before. We are not close. I do not know if close is what either of us wants or what the situation can support. But we are speaking in the language of actual things rather than the managed language of family performance, and that is new. Marcus and I are closer than we have been since childhood. Something about hearing my grandmother's words in that room dismantled something in him that he had been maintaining for a long time. He calls more than he used to. He asks real questions, which is not something he learned from our father, and which I think he is teaching himself deliberately. We are building something between us that neither of us knew was possible. My Aunt Carol and I have had dinner 3 times. She tells me stories about my grandmother that I had not heard, about who she was before she was a grandmother, about the things she gave up, and the things she chose, and the specific life she built inside 47 years in one house with a garden and 2 right chairs, and the patience of someone who understood that the most important things take their time. She said to me once over dinner, "Eleanor always said the same thing about you. She said Nora is the one who does the right thing when it's hard. She said it every time she talked about you, every single time." I said, "She never told me that." She said she didn't need to. She was too busy doing something about it. I want to say something about what my grandmother did, not the legal part, the human part. She watched. For years, she watched what was happening to me, and she did not intervene in the way that would have been most visible. The arguments, the confrontations, the attempts to reason with my father that would have created scenes and solved nothing, and cost her the specific kind of peace she needed to live her life well in her 80s. She chose a different kind of intervention. She planned. She prepared. She worked with an attorney for over a year. She wrote her own words into a legal document and made them part of a record that could not be quietly revised. She built something that would arrive after she was gone and could not be softened or managed or turned into a family dispute. She built something irrevocable. And she did all of it without telling me, because telling me would have changed it. She wanted me to receive the truth the same way I had always needed to receive it, as something that was simply already true, that did not require my approval or my cooperation or my awareness to exist. She gave me a gift, and she gave me a weapon, and she gave me a home, and she gave me words that I will carry for the rest of my life. She gave me all of those things in a single afternoon, in a conference room with a long table and 6 chairs, delivered by an attorney with a steady voice. She gave me the truth in a room where it could not be taken away. I want to say something to anyone watching this who has someone in their life like her. Someone quiet who watches and asks real questions and sits with you in the second right chair and says things that only make sense later. Pay attention to them, not because they might leave you something, because the quality of their attention to you is telling you something important about what you are worth. The people who see us clearly, not the version we perform, not the version that is convenient for everyone else, but the actual us, those people are rare. And when they speak, even slowly, even indirectly, even in a folder read aloud by an attorney after they are gone, the truth they have been holding is worth waiting for. She was right about me. I had always been enough. I just needed her to say it in a room that couldn't be walked out of. I want to say one more thing. About the morning my father said, "Don't come to the funeral." He thought he was cutting me off. He thought he was completing a severance he had been working toward for years. He thought the 7 words were a door being closed permanently. He didn't know that his mother had already built another door, had been building it for 14 months, quietly, in her own house, with her attorney's counsel and her own words. He said, "Don't come to the funeral," and his mother said, "Here is the house and the garden and the 2 right chairs and the written record of the truth of your family and the name of my attorney and everything I have built for you and trusted you with." She said all of that, in a room he had to sit in. Out loud, the door my father tried to close is not the door I walk through now. I walk through hers. I am Nora Calloway. I am 33 years old. I live in my grandmother's house on Alderman Street, where the dahlias are coming in fuller than I expected this year, and 2 right chairs sit on the back porch waiting for Sunday mornings. My father told me not to come to the funeral. My grandmother made sure I came to something better. Thank you for staying with me through every part of this story. I want to hear from you. Do you have someone in your life like a leaner, someone who sees you quietly and clearly, without conditions, without asking for anything back? Drop a comment and tell me about them. Even 1 sentence. Even just their name. And I want to ask you something. If you had been in that conference room when Philip Marsh read those words, what would have stayed with you longest? The bequests? Her written statement? My father's face? Drop a comment. Tell me what that moment would have meant to you. If this story found you somewhere real, please share it with someone who needs it today. Someone who has been told, in one language or another, that they stopped being part of the family a long time ago. Tell them, the door someone else tries to close is not the only door. Subscribe if you haven't. And come back for the next one. Until then, the chairs are still right.